So welcome everyone. This is the second seminar, and we've been conducting our seminars in thematic blocks since about mid-year, I think. And this is the second of a three seminar series around governance. And it's my really great pleasure to introduce Toni Bauman today. Toni would be known, I think, to a lot of you. She's currently a research fellow on the Indigenous Governance and Development Project, which she'll say a little bit more about today here at CAPA. She's an anthropologist, coach, mediator, facilitator, trainer, all-round legend, it says here, and was IATSA's Senior Research Fellow in Governance, Public Policy and Cultural Competence. Toni's got a wealth of experience in all sorts of areas around Indigenous land and native title claims, governance, agreement making, joint management of IPAs, government policy, cultural competence. It goes on and on. She's got a really varied and really interesting history, and has worked, as both a researcher, a consultant for government departments and statutory authorities, and for lots of Indigenous organisations over the years. So my really great pleasure to welcome you to speak today, Toni. And the format will be that we'll give Toni long enough to say what she wants to say, and then we'll have some questions at the end. Because we've got quite a few people online, can you please put your hands up at the end if you want to ask a question, or use the chat function. And if I miss you, just yell out and I'll get to you. Okay, over to you, Toni, and thanks a lot for giving the seminar today. We really appreciate it.
Thanks, Bill. I thought you said you were going to say I was awesome. Anyway.
I said you're a legend.
Yeah, no, that was pretty good. Yeah. It's all set up. Look, I really should start by acknowledging the traditional owners of wherever we are joining in from, and I'm in Canberra. In doing that, I really want to acknowledge the hardships and the intergenerational traumas that many of our Indigenous friends are suffering from at the moment, and have done and will continue to do. And I'm saying that because I think that's a very important part of what I want to talk about today as well. I also want to acknowledge Diane Smith, Dr. Diane Smith. The presentation that I'm giving today is actually derived from a joint paper that she and I have written as part of the Indigenous Governance and Development Project. The paper's in review at the moment, so when it gets published, you'll all be able to sort of read things in a bit more detail. I also want to apologise in advance for the density of some of my slides. I realise that they're more like PowerPoint notes, but as we agreed yesterday, Bill, I don't like using those PowerPoint notes. So I promise I won't go slavishly through each of them, but some slides are pretty busy, I realised this morning. And also, just a big shout out to anyone who I've worked with previously, and friends and people who've been kind enough to join me today. So I think we share the screen now, Bill. Is that the drill? So there is the screen. Can everyone see it? Yep. Okay, so this presentation today is about an Indigenous governance strategic self-analysis tool that the Indigenous Governance and Development Project is working on, and with the Australian Indigenous Governance Institute, and I welcome Jess and Katie and whoever out there maybe from AIGI, because we are working on this together as well. And we have a number of First Nations case study partners. Basically, the question is how groups are rebuilding self-determined governance and development agendas in diverse contexts with different outcomes and in their own terms. So the idea is to produce a strategic self-analysis tool to use on this journey, on this governance journey. I've been working specifically with 2 registered native title body corporates, or PBCs, in designing and trialling the tool. Buntamara in southwest Queensland, where I've been working with Queensland South Native Title Services, and the Burrangugudgeon Land Council with the Wodjablock people whose office is in Horsham in Victoria. And in the trialling, I'm hoping Noongar, who another case study partner, will also be involved. The project, as probably everybody's work, has been impacted by COVID, and we've had to do some kind of swift thinking around how to adjust to that, and I would have preferred to have done a lot more face-to-face fieldwork than I've been able to. But I want to talk about the context of the tool. What we see is the broad context in which everybody is existing is often undermining Indigenous self-determined governance and development rather than supporting it. There's a complex, high-pressured, imposed bureaucratic and legislative environments. In many places, the space is very crowded. Land rights, native title, resource agreement making treaties, closing the gap, multiple funding sources, engagement processes with assumed outcomes, and funding scarcities for what people really want to do. And you'll hear later, a lot of that is about being on country. And that, coupled with issues around well-being, such as the legacy of past violence and intergenerational trauma and the difficult living conditions and daily pressures, funerals, caring for lots of people and so on, all kind of mixed up with traditional Indigenous owned priorities and institutions and ways of doing things. So why this tool? What we see is a complicated jigsaw puzzle of systems and powers and structures and decision-making mechanisms at local, regional and national levels. Many people are overburdened. They have little time for, and energy for reflection, often doing imposed business which eats up any funding. The agenda of outside becomes dominant and opportunities for desired outcomes are lost. There is a need for people to collectively create and own. I can't get my slide in full focus, but that's better. Collectively created and owned pictures of the future in their own terms to guide decision making. Otherwise, they just get swamped by an external agenda. And arguably, groups will not get the most out of rights and benefits unless they have some serious internal conversations around how to manage all of this. Part of the lens for the tool is the discourse of rights, but it's not, and as you'll hear a bit later on, specifically related to rights in the same way that some other tools I'm going to talk about are. But our major concern in the project is that there is a rights polemic. That is, the terms are trotted out like self-determination, empowerment, co-design, sovereignty, and so on, as they are in Closing the Gap terminology. But no one really there are no shared meanings in practice across governments, publics and Indigenous groups, and including within them. And we know nothing much at all about what these terms mean to people locally. And indeed, in many instances that I'm aware of, are not even, haven't heard the terms before. Apart from that, we need to account for the local, culturally based ways of knowing and an understanding of rights internally vis-a-vis each other. So how people would express all of this in their own terms is of great interest to the project. And it's time for a rethink about governance. How can the right to determine collective governance and future development be realised in locally owned terms and practice? How can we rethink relationships with government and focus on Indigenous agency and local governance and solutions? And I want to just read to you David Ross, who was for a long time the director of the Central Land Council at the Northern Territory Aboriginal Government's Summit in Tennant Creek in 2013, what he says about governance, because I'm very tired of governance just being seen as compliance and finances and all the rest of it. And he says governance is not just a matter of service delivery, organisational compliance or management. It is about the self-determining ability and authority of clans, nations and communities to govern, to decide what you want for your future, to implement your own initiatives and to take responsibility for your decisions and actions. So I'll just give you a very brief overview. As part of the project, we have done a bit of a review of what tools are around. I'm not going to go into all the details of these tools, but I start with the international tools, and the first one is a strategic analysis, a practical tool for building Indian nations. It's directed at nations, operated organisations or companies, entrepreneurs and other native entities in the US, but also intended to be applicable to Canada and the First Nations there. It aims to assist in thinking through options to improve decisions and planning to promote economic development. And this is another issue for the project, the meaning of development, because we're talking about the governance of development. Should be designed to meet the goals of the native communities directly involved. Another Canadian tool is the British Columbia Assembly of First Nations Governance Toolkit, a guide to nation building, developed in relation to the work of the previous First Nations Attorney General Jody Wilson-Raybould. It's intended to assist nation building or rebuilding of governments at a group's own pace and based on its own priorities by steering away from the Indian Act. So you can start to see the synergies here. This is just a representation that was in Jody Wilson-Raybould's report on First Nations governance continuum and building on success. Another tool is the Canadian Centre for First Nations Governance. It has 5 pillars, and the focus here: the land, the people, law and jurisdictions, governing systems and resources. The paper chose to focus on the people pillar. Again, consultations with First Nations leaders, on-ground facilitators. The pillars blend traditional values with modern realities. And it is based on the fact that all First Nations can benefit by enacting some or all of the principles, no matter where they are on their path to self-governance. And that will echo, again, with what we're trying to do with this tool, because it is being designed with the idea that people can do it in different parts or join wherever they wish. This is the Canadian Institute of Governance. It's a mainstream organisation. It works with First Nation groups, including a national advisory group of Indigenous and governance leaders, principles grounded in the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and aspirations to self-determination. They developed a UNDRIP responsive self-determination governance framework, which you can see there, that form the basis for aligning First Nations. Ultimately, the idea is success in any one area depends on success in all, and you will see there's a range of different, in that circular diagram, many aspects of things that are impacting on each other for success. Another international tool is called the Indigenous Navigator. This is a collaborative initiative with the support of the European Union. It's managed by a global consortium composed of the International Work Group for Indigenous Affairs, the Indigenous Peoples International Centre for Policy Research and Education, the Asian Indigenous Peoples Pact, the Forest Peoples Program, and the Danish Institute for Human Rights. So it's a very broad church, and it has been trialled and piloted, and this site has some fantastic case studies on it. Interestingly, the primary focus of the Navigator is on data collection, in the belief that having good data provides a strong foundation for communities to engage and advocate. So community population data, and this tool is particularly aimed at how well national governments, measuring how well national governments and local communities are adhering to UNDRIP, Sustainable Development Goals, core UN human rights conventions, and other Indigenous related international obligations. So it's very much directly linked to the realisation of rights. The data collection processes are in fact a governance building exercise, and the obtaining of free, prior and informed consent into how data should be managed is part of it. The methods vary from place to place, but commonly community meetings, training seminars, focus group discussions, and so on. And they rank across 10 Indigenous domains: the recognition of identity, participation, self-government, government, and I can't read the rest of this on my screen. So consent, fundamental rights and freedoms, access to justice, and so on. So this tool has a diagram that is that ranks where people are at, with the highest score on the outside, and the centre is the lowest score. And you can see the kinds of issues that are being measured and addressed there. So now, I just want to make a few general comments about these tools. There's an amazing amount of information in there that can help the project. Some of them can be long and difficult to navigate. We would prefer to have quick questionnaires and checklists for key areas. Some have relatively formal English, and they're orientated to corporate and organisational governance. So what you see is often the business of tribal governments and councils, enterprise development strategies, administration, income generation, tax, training, education, culture, so on, and regulatory issues, which isn't the primary focus of the tool that we're trying to develop. They could also be resource intensive. A number of the training exercises that they recommend, would be quite expensive. They might also be seen to be limited by the difference in context between Australia and the US and Canadian contexts, where, you know, we know that American tribal governments, for example, often have legislative authority over things like law and justice and health, education, employment, and provide many services to communities, a bit like a mix of Australian local government and town councils. But in Australia, we have no legislative regimes for Indigenous self-government treaties or tax-based concessions and so on. Nevertheless, there are many commonalities to inform the proposed tool. Very useful methods for generating data. Sorry?
Fuck.
Oh. Assessment, scores, resources and explanations, issues of target audiences, focused content, how to collect quantitative and qualitative data and facilitation needs. And, you know, I'd urge you all to have a look at these tools if you're interested, because they do have a wealth of information and approaches to inform us. They also recognise the need to deal with diversity. And I think the big thing is that even though they may be different kind of jurisdictional kind of issues, the shared political and governance challenges, principles and issues are very common. For example, internal group membership, identity and inclusive decision making, the need for cohesive vision and leadership, the denial of rights. The themes come up over and over again. I want to get rid of this. Anyway, turning to Australia now, the Australian Indigenous Governance Institute, and I acknowledge their presence on this Zoom, has an online toolkit, and if you haven't had a look at it, I urge you to do so. It recognises that governance environments are always changing, highlights the need to assess the effectiveness of governance regularly, adopts a developmental approach, starts with strengths, challenges and rebuilding are then considered in the context of this. So there's a diagram there that kind of forms an overview of how the AIGI is approaching this. But at the same time, they may say that that's not completely true because we're revising the tools and that diagram's not in there anymore. I'm not sure. They can let me know. In the AIGI tools, you have sections such as nation building and development, headings such as kickstarting the process, 10 steps for the foundations of strong governance, tools for mapping a governance history, strategic planning. A lot of the tools are highly interactive, which is something that we're all aiming for, visual graphics, paintings, video interviews. It also has a number of health checks, including leadership and an overall governance health check. This is aimed at groups getting a quick snapshot of how their governance is working, topics, role and accountability, vision and purpose, decision-making, relationships, inclusiveness and so on. And the Governance Development Action Plan, which is based on a strategic planning development developed by the University of Sydney with input from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities and customised for evaluation and planning. The Seed to Tree or Community First Development Tool, and again, if any of you are on here, I welcome you and thank you for your collaboration, including providing this diagram of the Seed to Tree. It's an evolving tool. It's designed to be part of semi-structured interviews. The baseline assessments reflect where a community believes it's located on its governance journey towards a specific outcome, hence the Seed to Tree scale, which you see on the screen. 5 criteria for self-assessment: inclusiveness, sustainability, holism, interdependence, and iteration. A number of principles guiding the use of the tool: 3-way partnerships between bottom-up, top-down and outside-in, decisions based on evidence and data, not opinion, focus on behaviour change rather than on service provision. 7 tasks for using the tool, and I won't go through all of these, but there's a progression there and you can look at the Community First Development website and see those. They all provide learnings for the tool that we're developing and things to consider, such as what is the vision for the nation? How does a group know if it's on track? Who is the self in self-determination? What kind of nation or collective polity are people wanting to build or rebuild? Who are its members? Where do they live? What's the history of governance? What do we want our future governance to look like? How do we get there? How can internal divisions and trauma be healed in order to foster our social cohesion and united purpose? What rights and interests do people have? How can members participate? What are the priorities for action? How can the group plan and organise to get its own priorities done? What kinds of self-governance might be consented to now and still be acceptable in the future? What role do people want culture to play? Who should make decisions about these big matters and how? So what are the features of the tool that we're looking at? The first thing I think that's important is the engagement of communities of interest and the case studies in the development of the tool and in trialling the tool. So the first thing is that this tool is not aimed primarily at corporations, organisations or boards, although they might be involved. In the work that I'm doing with Buntamara and BGLC, and I think I forgot to mention them early. Oh no, I think I did. We're trying to say this, get more than the board members involved in the kind of work that's happening. So it's the focus on the nation or the polity or the community of interest. It's not the Western style, not on the Western style organisational structure that's set up to represent them. It requires active engagement with groups of communities of interest from the start in its design and as the ultimate users. Input from leaders, but others representing diversity in the community with age, gender, and so on. Accounting for different local needs, styles and priorities, terms and their meanings and place-based strengths, but at the same time being transferable to other places and scales of governance. The elicitation process of these meanings is the commonality. And the elicitation of these meanings will be likely to vary from one group to another. Top-down meaning bottom-up applies not just to government and Indigenous people, it also applies to representative relationships within Indigenous groups. The tool is designed to be used at any stage in the governance life cycle of a group so that it enables flexibility. And this is another key point here, starting with whoever wants to do the work, where they want to start, what they want to do, and progressing from there. I think one of the important things to understand about the tool is that it is very much an integral part of the project's research methodology framework. And it is guided by the idea that theory and practice are mutually informing. So some of the kind of principles that we're looking at in relation to that is the tool must be developed developmentally, designed, developed and used. It a participatory action process, which is part of the group's own governance building process. It's deliberative, collaborative, a facilitated approach to design and use. It's incremental development through self-reflection and renewal and transformative learning. Consideration of potential bias in self-analysis and reflexivity and being strategic. It's a facilitated Indigenous-led controlled process of adaptive transformative learning. Governance, adaptation or innovation is understood as a process of creating, gaining support for and implementing novel ideas or solutions to address collective needs and issues. And I think the key thing here, which I'll get to in a minute, is the use of the project's research methodology framework in development of the tool. So I just want to make the point here that it's not so much co-design, which is one of those words that's very popular at the moment. It's an integral part of a research methodology, is to think through and test a meaningful framework, including the place of culture. It's a group's own place-based journeys of self-governance renewal, where each group shapes its own local pathway, identifies rebuilding priorities, creates workable solutions, and considers the best means of implementing them. Deliberation involves determining the course of action regarding collective issues with collective reflection. Socially instituted process of adaptive change that can win members' approval if it is judged to have cultural integrity. Requires thinking through collective identity, institutional governance mechanisms and relationships. It's a lens for interaction with governments, public and industry to achieve own prioritised outcomes. It embeds common influential factors and challenges to customise locally. It is not static. It is adaptive and evolving to people's needs. Requires periodic deliberation, self-assessment and refinement by a group to identify their next steps, strengths and gaps and adapt priorities and practice. So you can see it's very different from the kinds of discussion that's been going on around co-design. I was going to say a little bit about transformative learning. And I think in order to begin to understand that, you need to understand governance first and foremost as a journey of process, best understood in how things are done, how everything comes together to get something done. The development of the tool is not only transformative, encouraging people to think about what they really value and want to strengthen, but it's also incremental and componential. Reinforces certain kinds of communication, so sharing, talking together, building consensus. The way learners interpret and reinterpret their experiences is central to making meaning and learning. Adopting this kind of learning conversation at the outset could really influence in innovative ways of thinking about many issues. For example, the management of disputes, the extent to which people want to embed cultural values, the kind of data that First Nations see as important for a baseline against which they want to measure their future progress, which could be completely different from the sort of data that is generally being collected. Building on each conversation and action, and then reflecting on progress, hopefully competence and solutions will follow. An important flexibility is it can be engaged in at whatever phase or stage a group is involved in. This part really interests me, not that it doesn't all, mind you, but strategic self-analysis and participatory evaluation. There are real interests in doing self-analysis, in all of us doing self-analysis around, or concerns around objectivity and our positions in the context of that analysis. This tool is asking people to look inward, for a group to assess how it's going in terms of its own goals. So we all know that in any self-analysis, we can be biased, antagonistic, we want to paint the best picture, or we can be intimidated from speaking out in a group. But strategic self-analysis, in my view, looks for critical reflection and reflexivity of individual and collective selves, including in engaging with each other. It requires groups and individuals to be strategic in moving from one point to the next. It requires owning and understanding the journey, its impacts on others along the way, and seriously considering all the factors at play. It requires a commitment to integrating individual responses into strategic ways of thinking. So that is trying to integrate differences as well as commonalities. It requires a diverse leadership and participant group, no single individual being able to hijack the process or outcome, and leaders being able to be make decisions on behalf of all, and to demonstrate inclusiveness and accountability, and first and foremost to have healing and trauma in their sites and begin the work of renewing of governance. I think there are some really important things to think about there. Now, I mentioned already that the tool is based firmly in the, sorry, I can't get rid of this bar and it keeps covering everything I'm trying to look at. So this is the research methodology. The key concepts are self-governance, development, and self-determination. It's got 7 themes, so starting with what do those terms mean? What's the self and the cultural foundations? Who are your key people to talk to? What are your group's desires and why? What are the opportunities? What are the challenges? What path are you walking to address these challenges and desires? Now, in having those discussions, there are a number of cross-cutting dimensions. So they raise issues of values, gender, generation, age, time, scale, language, rights and responsibilities, capabilities, assets, gaps, trauma and healing, and data governance. So one of the things that, we need to consider is terms such as nations, polities, communities of interest. What do they actually mean? So, and this term nation building, which is increasingly used, particularly on the eastern seaboard, I think, and maybe south, but a lot of people don't use the term nation that I know, and they prefer to use Indigenous, their own Indigenous terms for the group that they're thinking about. But nation building can be defined as a process by which nations as polities, so the polity exercising self-governing authority to achieve a shared vision, and this can take many forms on the ground. Also, we need to think about governance as network, governance and sociality, not discrete groups, and subject to change. So it's very important to actually be identifying representatives of a broad community of interest or polity in this exercise. And this may be any kind of Indigenous group and nation, or traditional owners, native title holders, clans, tribes, communities of identity and interest, elders, youth, men, women, health workers, and so on. But the appropriate community of interest is one which will enable people to participate, scaling up and scaling down according to what's required for public action. So the first thing is whomever wants to do the work in the design and use of the tool is the most appropriate community of interest to begin with. It's very important that the people who are involved in using the tool and designing it are really committed to the idea. So who wants to do the work could be arranged from an informal group of people committed to change, including champions of rebuilders, to directors, members of a corporation, cultural groups, etc. Leaders or representatives of various communities. The important thing here is that you have diverse interests and perspectives. Senior ritual leaders, anybody really identified by the group. These diverse perspectives will be critical to a group's fuller understanding of itself, because remember, Aboriginal societies are networked. They're not, bounded in the sense that nations are, and all of these communities of interest, if you like, are in one way or another interacting with each other. Can't understand yourself as an island. So tailoring these diverse perspectives to be meaningful to a range of users, and not just to an elite or a small rights-based group. When we're looking at working with people, including who might want to use the tool once it's fully developed, obviously some people will be more inclined to get involved than others, and not everyone will be interested or have the capacity to participate in the same way about the same issues. So who wants to do the work is a critical thing. There's a practical progression that can be followed in design and use of the tool. The important thing, this initial conversation, working towards a shared purpose in developing and using the tool, is really important. Also in identifying who does the work. So why is the tool needed? What could it do for you? How would you use it? What should be in it? Who is it for? How can renewal and governance be at the centre? How can strengths and challenges be identified? How will you know if the tool is working for you? So you start where people are at, progressing incrementally and according to identified priorities. Identifying the collective polity to do the work, establish how to adapt the generic tool to the group's needs, agree on and describe a shared vision for the nation's governance, create descriptive measures and standards that align with the vision. Now, I've mentioned already, but this is very important. What kind of baseline data do people want that actually measures their own understandings of where they want to go? How will it be stored and managed? And this process of free, prior and informed consent around data sovereignty and data management is a governance building exercise. And I'm sure there will be a need for different kind of baseline data. Then start a self-assessment. From there, identify priorities and planning and implementation measures. And the whole tool is cyclical as you return back at a future date to assess your progress and see whether it needs to be revised again. Obviously, there are questions around facilitation of these processes. Can we ever say what we really think, or even some of it? So we need to account for any lack of group cohesion, and this will often require agreed leaders or group members or staff members with skills or external third parties to act as a facilitator, to develop a culture of feedback and debriefing, to encourage trust amongst the group members to say what they really want to say, to truly critically reflect, and to have conversations about difficult issues without fearing repercussions. Skilled, facilitative, participatory development and consensus building processes can strategically challenge behaviours and attitudes for the collective good, recognise signs of change in attitude, and make strategic interventions, and thank you Morgan Brigg, who's here today, can be transformative. Doesn't mean you have to have, you know, a specific outcome. The process itself can be transformative. Considerations include issues of cost, knowledge, flexibility, accountability, ethics, readiness of groups to carry out self-evaluations, and so on. So that raises the question of who facilitates. Ideally, someone obviously in close relationship with a community who's going to actually be able to carry through with people, not a fly-in, fly-out kind of a thing. Known to sit in many camps, and Morgan, you may recall this was a favourite expression of our friend Charlie Watson, who referred to Indigenous peacemakers as people who could sit in many camps. Employing culturally sensitive methods, fostering broad community involvement, transferring skills and contributing to a long-term process of positive social change. The two strategies of having an internal and external facilitation, they're not necessarily separate choices, and they could be complementary, and there are advantages and disadvantages to both. So who does the facilitation is the critical issue, and that can only be agreed by the group itself. The external facilitators, critical friends known to the group or community, community leaders, staff, someone in the group, peacemakers, the chair, the deputy chair, or whatever. But the critical thing is that whoever is chosen is acceptable to everyone who's involved and has skills and is a skilled and effective facilitator. The positioning of the facilitator, so known to not be self kind of interested in any particular context. And another issue, of course, is if you get external facilitation, where would the resources come from? So part of the tool will have a facilitation guide or handbook, which will be structured around the themes in the research framework in the diagram I showed you earlier. It'll have information about process for using the tool, tips for managing having and managing reflexive conversations, advice on when a facilitator is needed, how to choose the most appropriate facilitator, a range of interactive facilitations and tools within tools, such as that tool at the bottom of the screen, which was developed by Diane Smith around your governance journey. So the tools within tools require culturally integrated interactive strategies. There are a number of all kinds of tools that we could use. Mapping governance history timeline, I'll show you a photograph of that in a minute. Mapping the group's contemporary governance, identifying local terms, visualizations, visions, goals, painting, drawing, storytelling techniques of your own and other experiences that have worked or not worked, conversations, tips and triggers, consensus building processes for working with a diversity of views and voices, not necessarily wanting everyone to agree, but understanding what it would take for dissenters to, as they say in deep democracy, to come with, and then trying to incorporate some of that dissent into the discussion. I want to talk to you about this, a couple of these last slides on learnings for the tool from the Arimonga meeting, what's important. This was a meeting of Buntamara in the southwest of Queensland, and if any of you heard Felicity Tyson from Queensland South Native Title Services last couple of weeks ago talking about this meeting, you will understand how important it was. For many, it was the first time that they had ever been on their country. They are scattered, they're a real diaspora, scattered all over Queensland and beyond. The costs of getting people together are enormous. And cutting into that came COVID. So in the end, none of the project team could actually go to the meeting. So we worked with the AIGI and QSNTS to develop a facilitation plan, which included a number of facilitation exercises that were trialled, providing some kind of little bit of facilitation sort of guidance and so on. So, but there has been a great collection of data from that meeting, including photographs, as you'll see there. This is the governance timeline exercise. You can see the line running along the middle of that big piece of butcher's paper there, and people adding in on certain dates, things that were important to them, what happened, who passed away, what their group was doing at the time, and so on. The really important thing about this meeting was the evaluations that were done by Buntamara. So 7.92, I'd like to say 8 out of 10 people said it was very, very useful. And the things that they really highlighted was being on country, learning, the joy of being together with family, teaching their own children on country. Beautiful country. It made me feel at home and welcome being on country. Now, this is not just isolated to the Buntamara experience. There are many groups across Australia who are not on their country, who are living, and this is in the Northern Territory and Northwest WA and so on, as much as it is in South, maybe not so much as, maybe they live, but it is a common problem. So in all of these kind of big talks about treaties and everything and land rights and all the rest of it, it's often the case that people are actually sitting in some air-conditioned room, well away from their country, making decisions about a place that they have never been to before. This is really a serious issue. I mean, the thing about what's happened to people, obviously, is that they've been moved all over the place. The joy that came out of from the Buntamara expressions of this meeting really highlight how important it is for well-being to be able to be on your country. So you get a young woman saying, understanding this is my country, it's my first time. I didn't even know where our land is and how far it goes. But at the same time, obviously there were some people were talking about jobs, licenses, training. And so you immediately see the disconnect. Who's prepared to move from their place to Arimonga when their children are all established in schools, when there are no jobs for them at Arimonga unless they could be created and so on. A big thing about the workshops was the enthusiasm from the youth, and also repeated assessments that they want more workshops for youth. People want more understanding of the Native Title Corporation, and they also said they didn't want to be sitting in halls all day. But up the top there on the right-hand corner is the work on the governance timeline, which was done in the hall, and then down below you can see people being having some cultural explanations given to them of a particular native well. But anyway, what I think it tells us is the disjunction between what people want and the legal and bureaucratic agenda, including closing the gap and well-being. And as we discussed when Felicity gave her presentation, I think a critical factor is where can people get money to actually be on country and transform their relationships with country and think about even whether they might want to live there. If we're talking about closing the gap and well-being, you know, that to me is a really crucial aspect of it. And so with the Barringah-Gudgeon Land Council in Victoria, the really critical question that I can see is how to do things in your own way, in your own terms. So COVID's been a problem there with Melbourne, as you know, having the longest, most lockdowns internationally, I think. But that has been a barrier. But nevertheless, we are progressing. But the really interesting thing to me is the crowded space in Victoria. Traditional Owner Settlement Act agreements, so Victoria has its own legislation. Native Title Claims and Agreement Mating, Treaty Assembly, First Nations Land Council, Native Title Services, the Federation of Land Councils, many corporations. There's a whole multiple players in this thing. And also the self-determination agenda that the Victorian government is leading and promoting. Multiple funding sources. So there's a program, Strong Roots and Nation Building packages, for example. But all of this, as far as I could see, is actually serving to overburden people. Can't involve the you can't involve the group or the polity or the nation or whatever you want to call it. It's too busy doing all this extra business. So that it creates a really complex decision-making environment, especially for Native Title corporations, I think. Because for them, in trying to work out how they want to make decisions themselves, they first have to look at the CATSI Act, rule books, ORIX requirements, which the CATSI Act is under in amendment processes at the moment, the Native Title Act, which was recently amended, the PBC regulations, which were recently amended, planning laws and so on. So this whole environment is constantly changing as well. So the goalposts change all the time as well, and often in the changes to the legislation take further away from people their ability to transform and act themselves, including about membership. So the future of the tool, yes, I know it is a challenge and I'm scared, but I do believe that it's outweighed by its potential contribution to courageous rebuilding efforts. And a standalone tool can also be part of a more comprehensive strategic process. The fundamental question is how best can the cultural and intercultural journeys of Indigenous Australians be mapped and then packaged into a flexible, user-friendly form. The Australian Indigenous Governance Institute will host the tool as part of its online toolkit. So hopefully it will be improved by being piloted widely, continued to be used by other groups and updated with new content. So the resources to administer and manage the tool process may be challenging, but nevertheless, the intention is that the tool will be used incrementally, providing opportunities to match its staged use with available capabilities and resources. So it doesn't all have to be done all at once, and it has to be carefully kind of designed to allow for that incremental sort of progression to happen. So that's it. Thank you very much.